The knock on the shop door came so hard that the glass rattled in its frame, and Elena Whitfield nearly dropped the teacup she was holding. It was not yet 8 in the morning. The street outside was empty except for a black car parked crooked against the curb, its engine still running. She set the cup down and walked to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Through the glass she saw a tall man in a dark coat, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the shop behind her as if he were searching for something specific. She had never seen him before in her life, yet something in the way he stood made her stomach tighten. "We are not open," she called through the glass. "I am not here to shop," the man said. His voice was low and clipped, the accent polished in a way that did not belong in this part of town. "I need to speak with you about a painting." Elena's hand froze on the lock. There were dozens of paintings in her grandmother's old shop, stacked in corners, leaning against shelves, wrapped in brown paper that had not been touched in years. She could not imagine which one would bring a stranger to her door before sunrise. "Which painting?" she said, not opening the door yet. "The one your grandmother kept behind the counter, the small one, with the woman in blue standing near a window." He paused. "I believe you inherited it 3 weeks ago." A cold feeling moved through her chest. Nobody outside her closest friends knew what she had inherited. She had not listed the painting for sale. She had not even hung it up. It sat wrapped in cloth on a shelf in the back room, exactly where her grandmother, Margaret Whitfield, had kept it locked away for as long as Elena could remember. "I don't know who told you that," Elena said, "but you need to leave." "My name is Alistair Kane," the man said, and something shifted in his face, something like exhaustion pressing through the polish. "I am not trying to frighten you. I only need to buy the painting. I will pay whatever you ask." Elena almost laughed. Nobody offered blank checks for old paintings found in the back of a failing antique shop. She had spent the last 3 weeks going through her grandmother's things, trying to decide what to keep and what to sell, just to cover the shop's debts. If this man was telling the truth, his offer could solve every problem she had. But the way he said it, the way his eyes would not quite meet hers, told her this was not a simple sale. "Come back when we're open," she said. And before he could answer, she turned the lock and walked away from the door, her heart hammering. She did not look back at the window. She did not need to. She could feel him standing there for a long moment before the car finally pulled away. Elena spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on the shop, dusting shelves that did not need dusting, rearranging books that did not need rearranging. Her friend Nora Bellamy arrived just after 9, her arms full of pastry bags and her mouth already running. "You would not believe the line at the bakery," Nora said, kicking the door shut behind her. "They ran out of the almond ones, so I got you the—" She stopped when she saw Elena's face. "What happened?" "A man came to the shop this morning. Before we opened, Elena took one of the pastry bags without really seeing it. He wanted to buy Grandma's painting, the one in the back." Nora's eyebrows lifted. "Which painting?" "You have about 40 of them back there. The one with the woman in blue. The one she never let anyone touch." Nora went quiet for a moment, and Elena understood why. Growing up, Elena had spent countless afternoons in this shop, watching her grandmother polish silver and haggle over old furniture, and the one rule that never changed was this: nobody touched the painting behind the counter, not customers, not friends, not even Elena, until the day her grandmother pressed the key into her hand and told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she would understand everything when the time came. The time had come 3 weeks ago, at the funeral, when the lawyer read the will, and Elena learned the shop and everything in it now belonged to her. She had unwrapped the painting only once, late one night, and found nothing more remarkable than a woman in a blue dress standing near a window, her face turned slightly away from the viewer, her hand resting on the sill as if she were waiting for someone. "Did he say why he wanted it?" Nora asked. "No, he just said his name. Alistair Kane." Elena said the name slowly, testing the shape of it in her mouth. "He offered to pay whatever I asked." Nora let out a low whistle. "Kane, as in the Kane family? The ones with the estate outside the city? The ones who show up in the papers every time there's a charity dinner?" Elena had heard the name before, vaguely, the way anyone who read a newspaper had heard of old wealthy families with old wealthy houses. She had never expected one of them standing on her doorstep at dawn. "I told him to come back when we're open," Elena said. "And you think he will?" Elena thought of the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his voice had cracked slightly on the word painting, as if it cost him something to even say it. "Yes," she said, "I think he will." The morning passed slower than usual. 2 regular customers came in, an older man searching for a set of chess pieces and a young couple browsing for a housewarming gift, but Elena found it hard to focus on either of them. Her eyes kept drifting toward the back room, toward the shelf where the painting sat wrapped in its cloth, undisturbed for 3 weeks. At noon, the bell above the door rang, and Elena looked up to see Alistair Kane standing in the doorway again, this time without the dark coat, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow as if he had been pacing outside for hours deciding whether to come back at all. "You said to return when you were open," he said. "You are open." Elena set down the ledger she had been pretending to read. "I am. That doesn't mean I'm selling." He stepped further into the shop, his eyes moving briefly over the shelves before settling back on her. Up close, she could see the lines of tiredness around his eyes, the kind that came from more than one sleepless night. "May I ask why your grandmother kept it hidden?" he said. "The painting." "I don't know," Elena admitted. "She never told me. She just said I would understand when the time was right." Something flickered across his face, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. "And has the time come?" "Not yet," Elena said, "because I still don't understand anything. Least of all why a stranger would show up at dawn offering me a fortune for a painting nobody's ever heard of." Alistair was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier polish, replaced by something rawer. "It belonged to my family," he said. "A long time ago. It was taken from us, and I have been trying to find it for years. When I learned it had surfaced here, in your grandmother's shop, I could not stay away." "Taken," Elena repeated. "You mean stolen?" "I mean it should never have left our house," Alistair said, choosing his words carefully. "There are things about that painting you do not know. Things that matter more than money." Elena studied him, trying to decide whether to believe a single word of it. There was something guarded in the way he spoke, as if he were offering her only the smallest piece of a much larger truth, testing to see how she would react before revealing more. "If it matters so much," she said slowly, "then tell me why. Tell me everything, and maybe I'll consider it." Alistair's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might turn and walk out, the same way he had turned to leave that morning. Instead, he glanced toward the back room, toward the shelf she had not pointed to, but somehow he seemed to sense exactly where it was. "It is not a short story," he said quietly, "and I am not certain you are ready to hear it." "Try me," Elena said. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, as if he were weighing a decision that had waited far too long to be made. "There was a scandal in my family," he began, "many years before either of us was born. My father never spoke of it, my grandfather made sure nobody did. But the painting was part of it, and I believe your grandmother knew far more about it than anyone realized." Elena felt a chill move through her, colder than the morning air that had followed him through the door. She thought of Margaret Whitfield, of the way her grandmother's hands used to shake slightly whenever she dusted near that particular shelf, of the locked drawer in the desk that Elena had not yet found the key for. "What kind of scandal?" she asked. Alistair's eyes met hers, steady now, no longer guarded. "The kind that could still destroy my family if it ever came out. And I believe the truth of it is hidden somewhere inside that painting." The shop fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the far wall. Elena looked toward the back room once more, toward the shelf where a woman in a blue dress had waited, undisturbed, for far longer than anyone had realized. "Then I think," she said slowly, "you had better come inside and sit down." Alistair hesitated at the threshold of the back room, glancing once more toward the shelf where the wrapped painting sat, as though even now he half expected it to vanish before he could reach it. Elena noticed the hesitation, and felt a strange mixture of sympathy and suspicion tangled together in her chest. Whatever this man wanted, it clearly meant more to him than money, and that frightened her more than any offer of cash ever could have. "Sit," she said again, gesturing to the small chair across from her own. "Before you say another word, I want to know one thing. Why come to a stranger's shop at dawn instead of simply writing a letter or sending a representative, the way people like you usually handle these things?" Alistair lowered himself into the chair slowly, as though the weight of the question required careful consideration. "Because representatives ask questions I am not ready to answer," he said, "and because I have waited for this painting far too long to trust it to anyone else's judgment. When my source told me it had surfaced here, I could not risk another week of delay." "Your source," Elena repeated. "So you've been searching for it?" "Actively. For nearly 2 years," Alistair admitted, quietly, without drawing attention, because the moment my search became public, every collector and opportunist in the country would have started looking for it themselves, driven only by the scent of scandal, rather than any real understanding of what it means. Elena studied him, noting the tired lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that he tried to hide by keeping them folded tightly in his lap. Whatever burden he carried, it had clearly worn on him for longer than these past few days. "You still haven't answered why it matters so much," she said. "Money, I understand. Pride, reputation, all of that I understand. But you look like a man chasing something more personal than either." "Because I am," Alistair said quietly, and for the first time since he had walked through her door, his voice lost its careful, practiced edge entirely, leaving something rawer and more honest in its place. "I am chasing the only piece of my father's real life that he ever allowed himself to keep." Alistair sat across from Elena at the small table in the back room, his hands folded tightly enough that his knuckles had gone pale. The painting still sat wrapped on the shelf behind him, and though he had not looked at it once since sitting down, Elena noticed how his shoulders remained turned slightly toward it, as if his whole body was aware of its presence even when his eyes were not. "Start from the beginning," Elena said. "All of it, not the version you tell reporters." He almost smiled at that, though there was no humor in it. "Very well. My grandfather, Edmund Kane, built the family fortune from shipping. By the time my father, Charles, was a young man, the family had more money than sense, and more secrets than either. My father fell in love with a woman our family considered unsuitable. She was a painter's daughter, from a family with no name worth mentioning in the circles my grandfather cared about." Elena's chest tightened at the mention of a painter's daughter, though she said nothing yet, waiting for him to continue. "My grandfather forbade the match," Alistair went on. "He arranged a marriage for my father, to someone from a family with the right name and the right money, and my father, being a dutiful son in every way except this one, obeyed. But before the wedding, he commissioned a portrait of the woman he truly loved. He kept it hidden in his study for years, long after his marriage, long after I was born." "The woman in blue," Elena said quietly. Alistair nodded. "That is what I believe. I never saw the painting myself until I was much older, and by then it had already disappeared from our house. My grandfather discovered it one day, and, according to the little my father ever told me, there was a terrible argument. Within a week the painting was gone, and my father never spoke of it again. Not once, not even when I asked him directly. So how do you know it's the same one?" "There is a mark on the back of the canvas," Alistair said. "A small symbol, shaped like two interlocking circles, painted by the artist himself as a signature only my father would recognize. If it is there, then this is the painting my father lost, and my grandfather's true reason for destroying that relationship is likely hidden with it." Elena felt her pulse quicken. She had unwrapped that painting only once, quickly, nervously, and she could not remember checking the back of the canvas at all. "You still haven't told me what any of this has to do with my grandmother," she said. Alistair's expression grew more careful. "That is the part I do not fully understand myself. I only know that when I began searching old shipping records and estate sales from that period, one name appeared again and again in connection with my father's household staff. A young woman named Margaret who worked as a companion to my father's sister before she vanished from all record entirely, right around the time the painting disappeared." The room seemed to tilt slightly around Elena. She gripped the edge of the table. "My grandmother worked for your family?" "I believe so," Alistair said, "though I cannot prove it yet. Records from that era were not always kept honestly, especially not by families eager to bury a scandal." Elena sat back, trying to absorb everything he had just told her. Her grandmother had never once mentioned working as a companion for a wealthy family, had never mentioned any connection to shipping money or country estates. She had lived her whole life running a small antique shop, quietly, without pretension, and yet somewhere in her past there was apparently a version of her that Elena had never known existed. "If she worked for your family," Elena said slowly, "then maybe she took the painting herself. Maybe she was the one who helped your father hide it, or helped him get it out of the house before your grandfather could destroy it." "That is exactly what I believe," Alistair said, "which means she may have known the entire truth of what happened between my father and that woman. And if there is anything hidden inside that painting, a letter, a note, anything at all, your grandmother may have put it there herself." Elena's mind raced back through every strange thing her grandmother had ever said about the shop, every locked drawer, every evasive answer whenever Elena had asked too many questions about the years before she opened the business. She had always assumed her grandmother simply preferred privacy. Now she wondered if there had been an entire life hidden behind that preference. "Why does it matter so much to you now?" Elena asked. "Your father is gone. Your grandfather is gone. What difference does an old scandal make to anyone alive today?" Alistair's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he had walked into the shop, Elena saw something beneath the polished exterior, something closer to grief than ambition. Because my father spent his entire life bound to a marriage he never wanted, and I believe it broke something in him that never healed, he said. He died 2 years ago, and in his final months, the only thing he asked of me, over and over, was to find the painting. He said if I found it, I would understand everything, including things about myself he never had the courage to explain while he was alive. The confession hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Elena had expected. She had assumed this was about money, about pride, about an old family's obsession with erasing embarrassment from its history. She had not expected it to sound like a son trying to fulfill his father's last wish. I still don't know if I can just hand it over, Elena said carefully. It was my grandmother's. She kept it locked away for a reason. And until I understand that reason, I owe it to her not to give it away to the first person who shows up asking. I understand, Alistair said, though the words seemed to cost him something. Will you at least let me see it, just to check for the mark? I will not ask you to sell it today. Elena hesitated, glancing toward the shelf where the painting waited beneath its cloth covering. Every instinct her grandmother had ever instilled in her told her to be cautious, to guard the shop's secrets the way Margaret had guarded them for decades. But another part of her, the part that had spent 3 lonely weeks going through a dead woman's belongings without a single answer to any of her questions, wanted desperately to know the truth. Fine, she said finally, but I unwrap it. You don't touch it. Alistair nodded, and something like relief passed briefly across his face. Elena rose and walked to the shelf, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the wrapped painting down and carried it to the table. She unfastened the twine carefully, peeling back the layers of cloth one at a time, aware of Alistair's eyes following every movement. When the final layer fell away, the woman in blue looked out at them both, her face turned slightly from the viewer, her hand resting on the windowsill as if waiting for someone who had never come. Elena had looked at this painting once before, quickly, in the dark, but seeing it now in the afternoon light, she noticed something she had missed the first time. The woman's eyes were not simply looking away. They were looking toward something just outside the frame, something the artist had chosen not to show. Carefully, gently, Elena turned the canvas over. There, near the bottom corner of the wooden frame, faint but unmistakable, were 2 interlocking circles, painted in the same hand as the portrait itself. Alistair went very still. That's it, he said quietly. That is exactly what my father described. Elena stared at the mark, her heart pounding. She had expected, somehow, that this would all turn out to be a mistake, a case of confused identity, a stranger chasing the wrong painting for the wrong reasons. But the mark was real, the connection was real. And somewhere behind that small painted symbol was a secret her grandmother had carried silently for most of her life. There's something else, Elena said suddenly, running her fingers along the edge of the wooden frame. Beneath the canvas, tucked into a narrow gap between the wood and the fabric, she felt the corner of something thin and brittle, like paper. Alistair leaned forward. What is it? Elena worked her fingers carefully along the gap, and after a moment, a folded piece of paper slid free, yellowed with age, its edges soft and worn from decades hidden in darkness. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Elena held the paper carefully, almost afraid to open it, as if doing so would release something that could never be put back. Do you want me to read it? She asked quietly. Or would you rather we wait until we know exactly what we're about to find? Alistair's eyes never left the folded paper in her hands. After all these years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I think we have both waited long enough. Elena set the folded paper carefully on the table between them, her fingers still resting lightly on its worn edge, as though letting go of it entirely might somehow break whatever fragile trust had begun forming between her and this stranger over the past hour. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift, throwing long shadows across the cluttered shelves of the shop, and somewhere in the distance a delivery truck rumbled past, oblivious to the quiet weight settling over the back room. Before I open it, Elena said, I need you to understand something. Whatever this letter says, it belonged to my grandmother. It's part of her life, her choices, her pain, long before it ever became part of your family's history. I won't let you use it simply to protect your family's name. Alistair met her gaze steadily. I am not asking to use it, he said. I am asking to understand it. There is a difference, even if my family has not always honored that difference in the past. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the calculated politeness he had worn like armor that morning. She found none. Whatever walls he had built around himself during their first encounter had begun, slowly, to come down. All right, she said finally. and drew a slow breath before easing the folded paper open the rest of the way, careful not to tear the brittle edges. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was still legible, slanted and hurried, as if the person writing it had known they did not have much time. "It's a letter," she said, scanning the first few lines. "Addressed to someone named Charles." Alistair's breath caught. "My father." Elena read aloud, her voice quiet in the stillness of the back room. "My dearest Charles," the letter began. "By the time you read this, I will be far from the house, and I pray you will forgive me for taking what does not belong to me. I could not let your father burn it, not after everything it cost us both. I have hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere your family will never think to look, and I will keep it until the day you are free to claim it as your own, or until the day I am no longer able to protect it myself. Know that I loved you as truly as any person has ever loved another, and that leaving your household was the hardest choice I have ever made. If fate is kind, we will meet again. If not, know that I kept my promise. Yours always, M." Elena's hands were shaking by the time she finished. "Yeah, ma'am," she said softly. "Margaret." Alistair sat back in his chair, his face pale. "She didn't just work for my family," he said slowly. "She was the woman my father loved, the one my grandfather refused to let him marry." Elena stared at the letter, trying to reconcile the woman described in those hurried lines with the grandmother she had known her entire life, the woman who baked bread every Sunday and complained about the price of tea and never once, not in 80 years, mentioned loving a man named Charles Kane. "This doesn't make sense," Elena said. "If she loved him, if she took the painting to protect it for him, why didn't she ever go back? Why did she keep it locked away for the rest of her life instead of returning it?" "I don't know," Alistair admitted, "but I intend to find out." Before either of them could say another word, the bell above the shop door rang sharply, and both of them turned toward the front room. A man in a gray coat stood just inside the entrance, his eyes sweeping over the shelves with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Elena did not recognize him, but something about the way he moved, quick and purposeful, made the hair on her arms rise. "Can I help you?" Elena called, quickly folding the letter and tucking it into her apron pocket. The man's eyes found her, then flicked briefly to Alistair before returning to her face. "I'm looking for a painting," he said. "A small portrait. I understand you may have recently acquired one." Elena felt her stomach drop. "Who told you that?" "A friend of the family," the man said smoothly, though his smile did not reach his eyes. "My employer collects historical pieces. He heard a rumor that something valuable had turned up in this shop, and he sent me to make an offer." "There's no painting for sale," Elena said firmly, stepping slightly in front of the doorway to the back room. "You should leave." The man's smile flickered, just for a moment, revealing something colder underneath. "That's unfortunate," he said. "My employer does not enjoy being told no." He glanced past her shoulder toward the back room, where the edge of the painting was still visible on the table. His eyes lingered there a beat too long. Alistair rose from his chair, his presence suddenly filling the small shop. "The lady asked you to leave," he said, his voice carrying the same clipped authority Elena had heard at the door that morning. The man's gaze shifted to Alistair, and something like recognition passed across his face. "Mr. Kane," he said slowly, "I did not expect to find you here." "You have the advantage of me," Alistair said coldly. "I don't know who you are." "My employer prefers to remain private for now," the man said, "but I'm certain you understand the value of privacy, given your family's history." He let the words hang in the air, deliberately pointed, before offering a shallow nod and turning toward the door. "I'll be in touch," he added, glancing once more at Elena. "One way or another." The bell rang again as he left, and the shop fell silent except for the sound of Elena's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "I don't know," Alistair said, his eyes still fixed on the door. "But whoever he works for already knows about the painting, and they seem to know a great deal about my family as well." Nora emerged from the storeroom where she had been sorting inventory, her face pale. "I heard everything from the back," she said. "Elena, that man was threatening you." "I know," Elena said, her mind racing. Word about the painting was spreading faster than she could have imagined, and if a stranger already knew enough to connect it to the Kane family's private history, then whoever he worked for was not simply a casual collector chasing rumors. Alistair turned to Elena, his expression grave. "I think it would be wise if you did not keep the painting here any longer. Not with people like that circling." "And where exactly would you suggest I take it?" Elena asked. "Your estate, so it can conveniently disappear into your family's possession the moment I hand it over?" "That is not what I meant," Alistair said, though a flicker of frustration crossed his face. I only meant somewhere secure. A bank vault, a trusted friend, anywhere safer than an unlocked shop on a street corner. Elena crossed her arms, torn between the practical wisdom of his suggestion and the instinctive distrust that had followed her ever since he first knocked on her door before sunrise. I'll think about it, she said finally. That evening, after Nora had gone home and the shop windows were dark, Elena sat alone in the back room, with the letter spread out on the table before her, reading it again and again, searching for any hint of meaning she might have missed. She thought of her grandmother's hands, always slightly trembling near that shelf, and wondered how many years Margaret had spent guarding this secret in silence, waiting for a day that never seemed to come. A soft knock came at the back door, the one that led to the alley behind the shop. Elena froze, her pulse spiking. Nobody used that door except deliveries, and never this late. She approached cautiously, peering through the small window set into the door, and felt a rush of relief when she recognized Alistair standing outside, his collar turned up against the evening chill. You shouldn't be here, she said, opening the door only partway. I couldn't stop thinking about that man in the gray coat, Alistair said. I wanted to make sure you were safe. Elena studied him for a moment, surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. I'm fine, she said. The painting is fine. It's locked in the safe. May I come in for a moment? He asked. There's something I found after I left, something I think you should see. Elena hesitated, then stepped back to let him inside. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, an old photograph, its edges worn soft with age. I went back to my family's archive this afternoon, he explained, spreading the photograph on the table beside the letter. I wanted to see if there was any record of a woman named Margaret in our household staff registry from that period. The photograph showed a group of people standing in front of a grand stone house, dressed in the formal clothing of a much earlier era. Alistair pointed to a young woman standing slightly apart from the others, her expression guarded, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera. Elena leaned closer, her breath catching. Even faded and worn by time, there was no mistaking the resemblance. It was her grandmother, decades younger than Elena had ever known her, standing in the shadow of a house that had apparently shaped the rest of her life. It's her, Elena whispered. There's a name written on the back, Alistair said, turning the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, Margaret, companion to Miss Eleanor Kane, and beside her name, in different handwriting, added later, a single word, dismissed. Dismissed, Elena repeated. So she was forced to leave. It would explain why she never returned, Alistair said quietly. If my grandfather discovered the relationship between her and my father, dismissing her from the household would have been the least severe punishment available to him. Elena sat back, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that seemed to grow more complicated with every new detail. Her grandmother had not simply chosen to walk away from a life she found unbearable. She had been cast out, separated from the man she loved, and left to carry a stolen painting and a hidden letter for the rest of her life, waiting for a reunion that time had eventually made impossible. There has to be more, Elena said. More letters, more records, something that explains why she never tried to find him again, or why he never tried to find her. I intend to find out, Alistair said, whatever it takes. As if summoned by his words, a sudden crash sounded from the front of the shop, glass shattering against the wooden floor. Elena's heart lurched, and both of them turned toward the sound just as a shadow moved quickly past the broken front window and disappeared into the darkness of the street outside. Elena rushed forward, her breath coming fast, and found a brick lying amid shards of broken glass on the shop floor, a folded note tied around it with a length of twine. With trembling hands, she untied the note and unfolded it. The message was short, written in a hurried, aggressive hand. Give us the painting, or the next visit will not be so gentle. Alistair read the note over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. This has gone far enough, he said. Whoever is behind this knows exactly what they're looking for, and they are not willing to wait. Elena stared at the broken glass scattered across the floor of the shop her grandmother had built with her own hands, the shop that had always felt like the safest place in the world, and felt something harden inside her that had not been there that morning. Then we find out who they are, she said, before they find a way to take what isn't theirs to take. Alistair knelt down and began carefully gathering the larger shards of glass from the floor, working in silence for a moment before speaking again. You should not stay here tonight, he said. Not until we know exactly who threw this and how much they already know. This is my home, Elena said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. I'm not going to be frightened out of my grandmother's shop by a note tied to a brick. I am not suggesting you abandon it, Alistair said gently. Only that you consider your safety for one night, while we decide how to respond. There is a difference between courage and carelessness, Elena, and I would rather see you angry with me for suggesting caution than see you hurt because I said nothing at all. Elena set down the broom she had been using to sweep the remaining glass, studying him for a long moment. There was something steadying in the quiet firmness of his concern, something that did not feel like the practiced charm of a man used to getting his way, but rather the plain honesty of someone who had already lost people he could not protect and refused to risk losing another. I'll think about it, she said finally, echoing the same words she had given him the night before, though this time they carried less resistance and more genuine consideration. Nora returned from locking the front register and surveyed the broken glass with a grim expression. I'm staying too, she announced, before either of them could argue. Nobody threatens my best friend and gets to enjoy an evening thinking they've won. Despite the tension pressing down on the small shop, Elena found herself almost smiling at Nora's fierce loyalty, a small, steady comfort amid everything else spinning rapidly out of her control. Morning brought a locksmith to repair the broken window and a police officer named Daniel Foss who took notes without much conviction, telling Elena that vandalism was common in the area and that she should install a better alarm system. Elena did not bother explaining that this was not simple vandalism. She doubted he would believe her even if she showed him the note still folded in her pocket. Alistair arrived shortly after the officer left, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he had not slept at all. I made some calls this morning, he said, handing her one of the cups. The man who came into your shop yesterday, the one in the gray coat, I believe I know who sent him. Who? Elena asked, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. A collector named Victor Ashgrove, Alistair said. He has spent years acquiring pieces with disputed histories, particularly anything connected to old family scandals. He has a reputation for finding leverage in other people's secrets and using it to force sales at a fraction of true value. And he already knows about the letter? About the connection to your family? I don't know how much he knows, Alistair admitted, but if he has been tracking rumors about the painting long enough to send someone to your shop within days of your grandmother's passing, then he has resources most people would not expect from a private collector. Elena set her coffee down, her mind working quickly. If he wants the painting badly enough to threaten me, then he already believes there's something valuable hidden inside it, something worth more than the painting itself. That would explain his interest, Alistair agreed. Though I still don't understand how he learned of its existence in the first place. Your grandmother kept this secret for decades without a single leak. It seems unlikely that a rumor would surface now, within weeks of her death, purely by coincidence. The thought settled uneasily between them. Elena thought back over the past 3 weeks, trying to remember anyone who might have had access to the shop, anyone who might have overheard a conversation, or noticed the painting during the process of sorting through her grandmother's belongings. The lawyer, she said suddenly, the one who handled the will. He came by the shop twice to review the inventory before everything was finalized. He asked a lot of questions about specific items, more than I thought was necessary. Do you remember his name? Gerald Whitmore, Elena said. He's been my grandmother's lawyer for years. I never had a reason to doubt him. Alistair's expression darkened. It would not be the first time a trusted advisor sold information to the highest bidder. If Ashgrove offered him enough money, it's possible he provided details about the estate that were never meant to leave your grandmother's private records. Elena felt a fresh wave of anger rise inside her, not just at the threat against her shop, but at the possibility that someone her grandmother had trusted for years might have betrayed that trust the moment she was no longer alive to know about it. I need to talk to him, she said. Today. I'll come with you, Alistair said immediately. No, Elena said, more firmly than she intended. If he's working with Ashgrove, showing up with you will only confirm that we know something is happening. I need him to think everything is normal. Let me handle this alone. Alistair looked as though he wanted to argue, but after a moment he nodded, though reluctantly. Be careful, he said. If he is involved, he may not be the only one watching your movements. The law office of Gerald Whitmore occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building a few streets from the shop, its windows overlooking a quiet courtyard that Elena had always found peaceful during her previous visits. Today it only made her more uneasy, the silence feeling less like calm and more like the stillness before something broke. Gerald greeted her with the same practiced warmth he always used, gesturing for her to sit across from his cluttered desk. Elena, he said, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is everything all right with the estate? Mostly, Elena said, keeping her voice light despite the tightness in her chest. I actually had a few questions about the inventory you compiled. I noticed some items missing from your original list that I found afterward, and I wanted to make sure everything was properly documented. She was lying, but the lie served its purpose. Gerald's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly, before settling back into practiced calm. Of course, he said, I did my best to catalog everything, though your grandmother kept some items rather obscurely stored. Was there something specific you found? A small painting, Elena said carefully, watching his face closely. A portrait of a woman in a blue dress. It was tucked away in the back, behind some other frames. Something shifted behind Gerald's eyes, a flicker of recognition he could not quite hide. I believe I do recall something matching that description, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Though I did not think it significant enough to note separately. Is it valuable? I'm not sure yet, Elena said. That's why I'm asking around. Gerald's fingers tapped lightly against the edge of his desk, a small, unconscious gesture that told Elena more than his words did. If you'd like, I could recommend an appraiser, he offered. Someone with experience in older pieces. It might be worth having it properly evaluated, especially if there's any chance it carries significant value. Do you know anyone specific? Elena asked, keeping her tone casual. There's a gentleman named Victor Ashgrove, Gerald said, and Elena's stomach turned to ice even as she kept her expression carefully neutral. He has quite a reputation in the field. I could reach out on your behalf, if you'd like. That won't be necessary, Elena said, rising from her chair before her anger could show on her face. Thank you for your time, Gerald. She left the office quickly, her hands shaking as she stepped out into the courtyard, the confirmation of Gerald's betrayal settling over her like a physical weight. Whether he had sold the information deliberately or simply mentioned it carelessly to the wrong person, the result was the same. Someone dangerous now knew exactly what she was hiding, and exactly how much it might be worth. She called Alistair from the courtyard, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. It's Gerald, she said. He knows Ashgrove personally. He practically offered to hand-deliver the painting himself. Where are you now? Alistair asked, his voice sharpening with concern. Walking back to the shop. Don't go straight there, he said. Meet me at the cafe on Ashford Street instead. If Ashgrove knows you spoke with Gerald today, he may already be watching the shop, waiting to see what you do next. Elena's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to walk calmly through the streets, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder every few steps. By the time she reached the small cafe, Alistair was already waiting at a corner table, his eyes scanning the street through the window. We need to move the painting somewhere safer, he said as soon as she sat down. Tonight, before Ashgrove has time to act on whatever Gerald told him. And take it where? Elena asked. You still haven't given me a good enough reason to trust that your family's estate is any safer than my shop. Alistair leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way she had not seen from him before. Because I have no intention of keeping it for myself, he said. I only want to understand what happened to my father, and to your grandmother. Once we know the full truth, I will help you decide what should happen to the painting, whether that means keeping it, selling it, or donating it somewhere it can be properly protected. You have my word. Elena studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the very real danger closing in around them both. She thought of the letter hidden in her apron pocket, of her grandmother's trembling hands near that shelf, of the word dismissed written in faded ink on the back of an old photograph. All right, she said finally, tonight. But I'm the one who decides where it goes, not you. Alistair nodded, relief evident on his face, agreed. As they finalized their plan in low voices, neither of them noticed the man in the gray coat sitting 2 tables away, his coffee untouched, his eyes fixed carefully on his phone, as he typed out a brief message and pressed send. Elena and Alistair lingered a while longer at the cafe, neither of them noticing the man slip quietly out the door once his message had been sent. They spoke in low voices about the practical details of the evening ahead, which roads to take, what time would draw the least attention, how to move the painting without anyone at the shop realizing exactly when it had left. We should leave separately, Alistair suggested. If anyone is watching the shop, 2 people leaving together with a wrapped package will draw far more suspicion than one person locking up for the night and a car simply passing through the alley an hour later. Elena nodded, though a small knot of unease had settled permanently in her stomach, since the brick had shattered her window the night before. I keep thinking about what that man said, she admitted, about my grandmother's history not being something anyone should keep private. It felt like he already knew more than he should. Ashgrove has a reputation for research bordering on obsession, Alistair said grimly. If he has been quietly investigating my family for any length of time, It would not surprise me if he uncovered fragments of your grandmother's connection, long before either of us ever knew to look for it ourselves. The thought unsettled Elena more than she wanted to admit. She had spent her whole life believing her grandmother's past was simply private, unremarkable, the ordinary story of a woman who built something small and steady out of nothing. Learning that a stranger had been quietly circling that history, waiting for the right moment to exploit it, made her feel as though the shop's walls, once so comforting, had become suddenly and permanently thin. Night fell quickly over the city, and Elena stood in the back room of the shop with the painting wrapped carefully in fresh cloth, her hands steady despite the anxiety twisting in her stomach. Nora had insisted on staying late to help, refusing to leave Elena alone after everything that had happened over the past 2 days. "Are you sure about this?" Nora asked, watching Elena secure the final knot of twine around the package. "Trusting a duke you met 2 days ago with your grandmother's biggest secret?" "I'm not sure of anything," Elena admitted. "But staying here isn't safe either, not after that brick through the window." A soft knock came at the back door. 3 quick taps followed by a pause, the signal Alistair had suggested earlier that afternoon. Elena crossed the room and opened the door to find him standing in the alley, his car parked just beyond the entrance, its lights off. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Ready," Elena confirmed, lifting the wrapped painting carefully. Nora hugged her tightly before she left. "Call me the moment you're somewhere safe," she said. "And if that man tries anything, I want a full report." Elena managed a small smile despite the tension coiled inside her. "I will." The drive out of the city took nearly an hour, the streets gradually giving way to open countryside, as Alistair navigated the winding roads with practiced ease. Elena sat in the passenger seat with the painting resting carefully across her lap, watching the darkened landscape pass by, her mind replaying every detail of the past 2 days. "Tell me about your father," she said eventually, breaking the silence. "Not the version in the newspapers, the real version." Alistair was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He was a quiet man," he said finally, "kind, in his own reserved way, but always carrying something unspoken beneath the surface. I used to think it was simply his nature, until he grew sick 2 years ago, and the walls he had built for most of his life finally began to crumble." "What did he say, near the end?" "He apologized," Alistair said softly, "for things I never understood at the time. He said he had spent his whole life honoring a promise he made to his own father, a promise that cost him something he could never get back. He never explained what he meant, not clearly, but he made me swear to find the painting, no matter how long it took." Elena watched the passing shadows of trees along the roadside, thinking of the letter tucked safely in her bag now, of the words Margaret had written decades ago with such quiet certainty that fate would eventually bring her and Charles back together. Fate, it seemed, had chosen a much crueler path for both of them. "Do you think they ever tried to find each other again?" Elena asked, after she was dismissed. "I don't know," Alistair admitted, "but I intend to find out, whatever the answer costs either of us." They arrived at the Kane estate just before midnight, the grand stone house rising out of the darkness like something from an old photograph brought suddenly to life. Elena recognized it immediately from the picture Alistair had shown her, though decades had clearly softened its edges, ivy now climbing the walls that had once stood starkly formal and severe. Alistair led her inside through a side entrance, avoiding the main hall where staff might still be awake, and guided her to a small study lined with old books and family portraits. He set the wrapped painting carefully on a table beneath a soft reading lamp and began unwrapping it with careful, practiced hands. "There's something I want to show you," he said, once the painting rested fully uncovered on the table. He crossed to a locked cabinet in the corner of the study, retrieving a small leather journal that looked as worn and aged as the letter Elena carried in her bag. "My father's private journal," he explained, setting it beside the painting. "I found it among his belongings after he passed, though most of the entries are too vague to make sense of on their own. I believe, now, that many of them refer to your grandmother." Elena opened the journal carefully, scanning the faded handwriting inside. Most entries were brief, fragmentary, written in a private code of initials and half-finished thoughts that only made sense once she understood the context Alistair had provided. "M came again today," one entry read. "My father grows suspicious. I fear what he will do if he discovers the truth before I find a way to protect her." Another entry, dated several weeks later, read simply, "She is gone. My father says it is for the best. I do not believe I will ever forgive him." Elena's throat tightened as she read further, each entry revealing another fragment of a heartbreak that had apparently shaped the rest of Charles Kane's life. A wound he carried silently for decades without ever finding the courage or the opportunity to heal it. The final relevant entry, dated many years later, made Elena's breath catch entirely. I received word today that M is alive, the entry read. She has opened a small shop in the city, far from everything we once knew. I have thought, many times, of going to her, of finally explaining everything my father forced me to hide. But too much time has passed, and I fear what such a reunion might cost us both, given everything else I am now bound to protect. He knew, Elena whispered. He knew where she was, and he never went to her. Alistair's face had gone pale as he read the entry over her shoulder. I don't understand, he said. If he knew, why would he simply let her go? Why keep the painting a secret for the rest of his life, instead of finally reclaiming it? Elena thought of the phrase, everything else I am now bound to protect, and a slow, uncomfortable realization began forming in her mind. Maybe it wasn't only about the painting, she said slowly. Maybe there was something else your father was protecting, something that mattered even more to him than reuniting with the woman he loved. Before Alistair could respond, the sound of tires crunching against gravel echoed from outside the study window. Both of them froze, exchanging a sharp look before Alistair moved quickly to the window, peering carefully through the curtains into the darkness beyond. There's a car, he said, his voice low and tense, parked just beyond the gate. I don't recognize it. Elena's heart began pounding hard against her ribs. Ashgrove, she said. He must have followed us. That's not possible, Alistair said, though uncertainty colored his voice. We were careful. Nobody followed us on the road. Then how does he know we're here? Elena asked, panic creeping into her voice as she quickly began rewrapping the painting, her hands fumbling with the cloth. A sharp knock echoed suddenly from the front entrance of the house, far too aggressive to belong to any expected visitor. Alistair's expression hardened, and he moved quickly to a small drawer in his father's desk, retrieving a set of keys. There's a passage beneath the study, he said quickly. My grandfather built it decades ago, back when the family still worried about wartime raids. Almost nobody remembers it exists anymore. Take the painting and the journal, and go. I'll deal with whoever is at the door. I'm not leaving you here alone, Elena said firmly. You have to, Alistair said, gripping her shoulders gently but urgently. If Ashgrove has finally found a way to threaten this family directly, then I need to face him myself, without giving him any reason to suspect where the painting has gone. Please, Elena. Trust me on this. Elena hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, gathering the wrapped painting and the leather journal into her arms as Alistair led her quickly to a hidden panel behind one of the bookshelves, revealing a narrow stone stairway descending into darkness. Follow the passage until you reach a door marked with an old family crest, he instructed quickly. It leads out near the stables, far from the main house. Take my car. The keys are in my coat pocket. Before Elena could respond, he pressed the keys into her hand, his fingers lingering against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Whatever happens, he said quietly, promise me you'll protect the truth, even if you can't protect me tonight. Elena's chest tightened with an emotion she did not have time to examine closely. I promise, she said, before disappearing down the narrow stone stairway. The painting clutched tightly against her chest as the sound of raised voices began echoing faintly from somewhere above her in the grand old house. The stone steps seemed to stretch on longer than she expected, curving downward through darkness broken only by the thin beam of her flashlight. Elena counted her breaths to keep her mind steady. The painting pressed so tightly against her chest that her arms had begun to ache. Every few steps she paused, straining to hear whether the voices above had grown louder or quieter, whether anything in their tone suggested danger rather than mere negotiation. She thought of her grandmother running through unfamiliar passages of her own, decades earlier, carrying secrets far heavier than a single painting, and found a strange thread of comfort in the thought that she was not the first woman in this story to move quickly through darkness while protecting something too important to lose. Whatever fear pressed at the edges of her thoughts, she forced herself to keep moving, one careful step after another, until the passage finally leveled out and a narrow wooden door appeared ahead, marked faintly with the same crest Alistair had described. She pushed it open into the cool night air, the stables rising dark and quiet just beyond a small paddock fence, and allowed herself, for the first time since descending into the passage, a single steadying breath. The passage beneath the house smelled of stone and old dust, the narrow stairway lit only by a small flashlight Elena found tucked into a bracket on the wall, exactly where Alistair had promised it would be. She moved as quickly as she dared, the painting and journal held tightly against her chest, her ears straining for any sound from the house above. By the time she emerged near the stables, her hands were trembling from more than just the cold night air. She found Alistair's car parked exactly where he said it would be, and she slid into the driver's seat, setting the painting carefully on the passenger side before starting the engine with shaking hands. She did not drive far. She could not bring herself to leave him alone in that house, facing whatever danger had arrived at his door, without knowing whether he was safe. Instead, she parked the car just beyond the tree line at the edge of the estate, hidden from the main road, and watched the house through the darkness, her heart pounding with every passing minute. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the front door of the house opened again, spilling light onto the gravel drive. Elena watched as two figures emerged, and her stomach clenched when she recognized the man in the gray coat walking beside Alistair, though something in their posture told her this was not simply a confrontation between enemies. She waited until the unfamiliar car pulled away from the estate before starting the engine again and driving back toward the house, her nerves stretched thin with uncertainty. Alistair stood alone on the front steps when she arrived, his expression difficult to read in the dim porch light. "What happened?" Elena asked, climbing out of the car. "Is it Ashgrove? Did he threaten you?" "It wasn't Ashgrove," Alistair said, his voice strangely quiet. "It was the man who works for him. He came to deliver a message, not a threat exactly, though it might as well have been one." "What message?" Alistair ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Ashgrove knows everything," he said, "about the letter, about my father's journal, about the connection between our families. He says he has proof that my grandfather's shipping fortune was built partly on fraud, and that the scandal involving my father and your grandmother was only the beginning of a much larger cover-up my family has spent generations concealing." Elena felt the ground shift slightly beneath her. "What kind of fraud?" "I don't know the full details yet," Alistair admitted, "but Ashgrove is threatening to make everything public unless I hand over the painting, along with any documents connected to it. He believes there is something else hidden within it, something more valuable than a simple love letter." Elena's mind raced back to the journal entry she had read only minutes earlier, the phrase, "everything else I am now bound to protect," echoing uncomfortably in her thoughts. "Your father wrote about protecting something," she said slowly. "Something beyond his relationship with my grandmother. What if that's exactly what Ashgrove is looking for?" Alistair's expression grew troubled. "My grandfather's shipping company faced serious financial trouble decades ago, right around the time my father's relationship with your grandmother was discovered. I always assumed the two events were unrelated, but perhaps they were connected in ways I never considered." They returned to the study together, the wrapped painting once again resting beneath the soft reading lamp. Elena carefully unwrapped it a final time, and together they examined every inch of the canvas and its wooden frame, searching for anything they might have missed. It was Elena who noticed it first, a slight unevenness along the bottom edge of the frame, barely visible unless the light caught it at exactly the right angle. She ran her fingers carefully along the seam and felt a faint give beneath the wood, as though a small section had been carefully carved out and fitted back into place. "There's something here," she said, working her fingers gently along the hidden seam until a small wooden panel came loose, revealing a narrow hollow space built directly into the frame itself. Inside, folded many times over to fit the tiny space, was a second document, far more official in appearance than the letter Margaret had written. Elena carefully unfolded it, smoothing the creases as best she could, and both of them leaned closer to read the faded print. It was a ledger page, torn from what appeared to be an old shipping company's financial records, detailing a series of transactions that made little sense to Elena at first glance. But Alistair's face grew increasingly pale as he studied the numbers and names listed along the margins. "These are falsified records," he said quietly. "My grandfather reported significant losses during this period, enough to justify raising prices and cutting wages across his entire company. But according to this page, the actual profits during that same period were nearly triple what he claimed publicly." "So he lied," Elena said, "about losing money." "Worse than that," Alistair said grimly. "If these figures are accurate, he deliberately falsified financial records to justify exploiting his own workers while quietly pocketing the difference. If your grandmother discovered this somehow, perhaps through her position within the household, it would explain far more than a simple forbidden romance." Elena's breath caught as pieces of the puzzle finally began settling into place. "That's why she was dismissed so suddenly," she said. "It wasn't only because of her relationship with your father. Your grandfather was protecting his fraud, and she had become a liability the moment she learned the truth. And the painting," Alistair added slowly, "became the perfect hiding place for evidence he could never risk destroying entirely, in case he ever needed proof to protect himself from his own partners or investors." "But why would your grandmother agree to hide it?" Elena asked. If she knew what it proved, why not expose him immediately? Alistair considered this for a long moment. Perhaps she didn't have a choice, he said finally. If my grandfather threatened her, or threatened my father, exposing the fraud might have endangered the very people she was trying to protect. Hiding the evidence, keeping it safe without using it, may have been the only way she could protect herself and my father both. Elena thought of her grandmother's trembling hands near that shelf, of the decades she had spent quietly running her small shop, never once revealing the extraordinary secret she carried within its walls. It had not been simple sentiment that kept Margaret from selling or discarding that painting. It had been an act of quiet, lifelong courage, protecting evidence that could destroy a powerful family, while never once using it for her own gain. We need to decide what to do with this, Elena said, holding the fragile ledger page carefully. If Ashgrove already suspects there's evidence hidden inside the painting, he won't stop coming after it, regardless of what we decide. Then we take away his reason to want it, Alistair said, a new resolve hardening his voice. If the truth about my grandfather's fraud becomes public on our terms, openly and completely, there will be nothing left for Ashgrove to use as leverage against my family. The scandal will lose its power the moment it stops being a secret. Elena studied him carefully. You would do that? Expose your own family's history just to protect a stranger's grandmother's memory? She protected my father, Alistair said quietly. She protected the truth for decades, at tremendous cost to her own happiness. The very least I can do is finish what she started, rather than allowing men like Ashgrove to profit from secrets that were never his to exploit. They spent the following days working carefully alongside a journalist Alistair trusted, verifying the ledger page against surviving shipping records from the period, piecing together a story that stretched far beyond a simple forbidden romance into a genuine reckoning with decades of hidden corporate fraud. When the story finally broke, it dominated headlines for nearly a week, forcing long overdue conversations about accountability that the Kane family had avoided for generations. Ashgrove, stripped of the leverage he had hoped to exploit, quietly withdrew from pursuing the painting any further, his interest evaporating the moment there was nothing left to gain from threats or secrecy. Gerald Whitmore, when confronted publicly about his role in leaking information, resigned from his practice within the month, his reputation irreparably damaged by the scandal his own greed had helped create. Elena stood beside Alistair at a small gathering held weeks later, not in the grand halls of the Kane estate, but in the quiet courtyard behind her grandmother's shop, where they had decided together that the painting would finally be displayed publicly, alongside a plaque explaining its full history for the first time. She would have hated all this attention, Elena said softly, looking up at the portrait now hanging proudly in the newly renovated shop window. But I think she would have been proud that the truth finally came out, even if it took decades longer than it should have. My father would have felt the same, Alistair said, standing close beside her. I only wish he had lived long enough to see it happen. Elena turned to look at him, studying the quiet relief evident in his expression, so different from the guarded, exhausted stranger who had knocked on her door before dawn only weeks earlier. What happens now? She asked. Between our families, I mean. Between us. Alistair considered the question carefully, his eyes steady on hers. I suppose that depends entirely on what you want it to become, he said. I know I came into your life uninvited, chasing a secret that nearly cost you everything. But I find, now that the truth is finally settled, that I am not eager to walk away from what we've built together these past weeks. Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest, something she had not expected to feel after everything they had endured together. Neither am I, she admitted quietly. The woman in blue watched over them from her place in the window, her painted eyes finally free of secrets, finally at rest after decades spent guarding a truth too heavy for one small painting to carry alone. Elena liked to imagine, somehow, that her grandmother had known this day would come eventually, that patience and quiet courage would finally be rewarded with the peace that had eluded her for most of her life. As the small crowd gathered to admire the painting and its remarkable story, Elena reached for Alistair's hand, and neither of them let go. Later that evening, once the small crowd had thinned and Nora had begun closing up the register for the night, Elena stood alone for a moment in front of the painting, studying the woman in blue one final time before switching off the shop lights. She thought of every version of her grandmother she had known throughout her life, the quiet shopkeeper, the careful guardian of a locked shelf, and now, finally, the young woman who had loved fiercely enough to risk everything rather than let the truth be destroyed. Thank you, she whispered to the empty shop, for trusting me with all of it, even if you never got the chance to tell me yourself. Alistair waited for her outside, leaning against his car beneath the soft glow of the street lamp, and when she stepped out to join him, he did not ask what she had been doing inside alone. Lee simply reached for her hand again, and together they walked into the quiet evening, leaving the painting to keep its silent, peaceful watch over the shop that had finally learned to hold its history openly. 6 months passed before Elena truly understood how much her life had changed since the morning a stranger knocked on her door before sunrise. The shop looked different now, brighter somehow, though she could never quite explain why to the customers who commented on it. Perhaps it was simply the absence of secrets pressing down on every shelf and drawer, or perhaps it was something less definable, a lightness that had settled over the place once the truth had finally been allowed to breathe. The painting remained exactly where they had decided to place it, hanging in the front window where morning light caught the folds of the woman's blue dress and made the old canvas seem almost alive. Visitors came from across the city just to see it, drawn by the story that had spread far beyond the small neighborhood where Elena's grandmother had once quietly run her business without any expectation of fame or attention. Nora had taken to giving informal tours to curious customers, embellishing certain details with theatrical flourish that made Elena laugh despite herself. "You're turning my grandmother's tragic love story into a circus act," she told her one afternoon, watching Nora gesture dramatically toward the painting for a group of schoolchildren on a history outing. "I'm turning it into something people will remember," Nora corrected, grinning. "There's a difference." Elena supposed there was. She had spent so many years assuming her grandmother's life had been small and quiet, defined by nothing more remarkable than antique furniture and stubborn independence. Learning the truth had reshaped every memory she carried, transforming ordinary moments into echoes of a much larger story that Margaret had carried silently for decades. Alistair visited often, though never in the guarded, urgent way he had that first morning. He came now with an ease that still occasionally surprised her, settling into the back room with a cup of tea while Elena worked through inventory, content simply to be present rather than pursuing any hidden agenda. The Kane family's reputation had suffered initially after the scandal broke, though Alistair had approached the fallout with a transparency his grandfather and father had never dared attempt. He established a foundation using a significant portion of the family's shipping fortune, dedicated to supporting fair labor practices and providing restitution to descendants of workers who had been affected by his grandfather's fraud decades earlier. It was not a perfect solution, he told Elena honestly, but it was a beginning, and beginnings mattered more than most people realized. "My father would have hated the attention," Alistair admitted one evening, sitting across from Elena in the quiet shop after closing. "But I think, given everything we found in his journal, he would have understood why it needed to happen this way." "Do you still think about what he wrote?" Elena asked. "About being bound to protect something?" "Every day," Alistair said. "I used to believe he meant only the family's reputation. Now I understand he meant something far more complicated. Loyalty, guilt, love he was never allowed to express openly. It all tangled together into something he carried silently for most of his life, the same way your grandmother carried her own version of that burden." Elena reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "At least neither of them has to carry it alone anymore," she said softly. Word of their unlikely partnership, professional and increasingly personal, had begun circulating through certain social circles, though Elena found she cared far less about public opinion than she once might have expected. She was not interested in becoming a fixture within Alistair's world of formal dinners and old family names. She was interested in him, in the quiet strength he had shown throughout everything they endured together, in the way he had chosen truth over comfort, when it would have been far easier to simply let the past remain buried. One afternoon, nearly 8 months after that first fateful knock on her door, Elena received an unexpected visitor at the shop, an elderly woman who introduced herself as a distant cousin of her grandmother's, someone Elena had never known existed. The woman carried with her a small box of old photographs and letters, explaining that she had followed news of the painting's story with great interest, recognizing details about her own family history she had never fully understood until now. Among the photographs was one that made Elena's breath catch entirely, an image of Margaret much later in life, standing outside a small shop that Elena immediately recognized as the very building she now stood inside. Beside her, unmistakably, stood an older version of Charles Kane, both of them smiling in a way that suggested a private joy neither had ever spoken of publicly. "When was this taken?" Elena asked, her voice unsteady. "According to the date on the back, only a few years before your grandmother passed," the cousin explained. "I always wondered about that gentleman in the photograph, though nobody in the family ever explained who he was." Elena showed the photograph to Alistair later that evening, both of them studying it in silence for a long moment. They found each other again, she said softly. After everything, after all those years apart, they found a way back to each other eventually. Quietly, Alistair added, his voice thick with emotion, without ever disrupting either of their separate lives, without ever risking exposure, just enough to know the other was still there, still remembered, still loved. It was, Elena thought, perhaps the most fitting ending either of them could have hoped to discover. Proof that love and loyalty had persisted quietly beneath the surface of two carefully guarded lives, waiting patiently for a resolution that had finally arrived decades later than it should have, carried forward by the very people neither Margaret nor Charles had lived to see grow close themselves. That evening, after closing the shop and turning the small brass sign in the window to indicate they were closed for the day, Elena stood beside Alistair beneath the painting that had brought them together, watching the last light of evening catch against the woman's painted blue dress. "Do you think she knew?" Elena asked quietly, "that someday, someone would finally uncover everything she protected?" "I think," Alistair said, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders, "she hoped for exactly this. Not just the truth coming to light, but something good growing out of everything she sacrificed to protect it." Elena leaned into him, watching the painted woman's face catch the last of the golden evening light, her expression finally at peace after decades spent waiting silently within these walls. Whatever came next for Elena and Alistair, whatever challenges their unlikely partnership might still face, she felt certain of one thing above all else. The secrets that had once divided two families across generations had finally, quietly, become the very thing that brought them together, stitching closed a wound that had been left open for far too long. Outside, the evening settled gently over the small shop, and inside, two people who might never have met without an old painting's hidden truth, stood quietly together, finally free of the shadows that had haunted both their families for far longer than either of them had ever realized.